The morning was cold and the streets were unusually quiet. A man walked slowly along the sidewalk, his shoes worn down and his coat torn in several places. His beard had grown uneven, and his tired eyes carried stories most people could never imagine. He was once a soldier, someone who had stood tall in uniform, respected for his bravery. But now he was just another homeless man that people passed by without a second glance. He had slept on a park bench the night before, using a thin blanket that barely protected him from the chill. As he got up that morning, his body ached from the hard surface and the cold wind. He rubbed his hands together to warm them, then patted his pockets, counting the few coins he had left. It wasn't much. Enough for maybe a small coffee or a piece of bread, but certainly not enough for a full meal. Still, he hoped someone would show kindness. The man was not someone who liked to beg. He had pride, the kind of pride that came from years of serving his country and protecting others. He had seen things in war that had left deep scars on his mind, and though he no longer wore the uniform, he carried the weight of it every day. He didn't want pity, only a fair chance at a meal and maybe a little respect. As he walked through the streets, he passed busy shops and people rushing to work. Some glanced at him, most didn't. A few tightened their grip on their bags or looked away, pretending not to see him. He was used to it. In the city, people were always in a hurry, always too busy to stop and think about someone else's struggle. But inside, he still felt the sting of being invisible. His stomach growled loudly, reminding him of the last meal he had eaten, a half sandwich someone had handed him 2 days ago. Hunger gnawed at him, making his legs weaker with every step. He spotted a small diner on the corner, the kind of place where the smell of fried eggs and bacon filled the air, and coffee mugs clinked against plates. He stood outside for a moment, breathing in the warm scent that drifted through the door every time a customer walked in. Gathering courage, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The warmth of the diner hit him immediately, a sharp contrast to the cold air outside. He could hear laughter, the scrape of chairs, and the sizzling sound of food on the grill. For a brief moment, he felt like he belonged, but as soon as the waitress saw him, her expression shifted. Her cheerful smile faded, replaced by a frown. He walked up to the counter, speaking politely. "Excuse me," he said softly, placing the few coins on the counter. "I don't have much, but could I please have a small sandwich? Just something simple." His voice was steady, but inside he felt nervous, hoping they would understand. The waitress glanced at the coins, then at him, and let out a laugh. "A sandwich? With this?" she said loudly enough for a few nearby customers to hear. "Sir, this isn't a charity. We sell food here, not handouts." A couple of people at the counter turned their heads, some chuckled, while others just shook their heads and went back to eating. The man lowered his eyes, embarrassed. He wasn't asking for free food. He was offering what little he had, but the laughter cut through him like a blade. He wanted to explain that he had once served his country, that he had risked his life so people like her could live freely. But the words never left his mouth. Pride held him back, and so did the fear of being humiliated further. He gently picked up his coins, whispering, "Thank you anyway." Then he turned and walked toward the door. As he left, a group of young men sitting at a table near the window laughed loudly, making jokes about him. He pretended not to hear them, but his shoulders slumped as he pushed the door open and stepped back into the cold. Outside, the city noise swallowed him again. Cars honked, people talked on their phones, and life went on as if nothing had happened. He leaned against the wall for a moment, closing his eyes. The hunger was worse now, mixed with the heavy weight of shame. He wondered how things had gone so wrong, how a man who had once been saluted, who had once been trusted to carry out dangerous missions, could now be treated like a worthless beggar. Memories flooded back, marching with his fellow soldiers, the sound of boots hitting the ground in unison, the pride in his chest when he held the flag high. He remembered the friendships, the brotherhood, the sense of purpose, and then he remembered the battles, the explosions, the screams. Those memories were harder, and they stayed with him long after the war had ended. The war had ended for others, but inside him it still raged every day. He shook the memories away, forcing himself to keep moving. He didn't want to sit down yet. If he sat, he might not have the strength to get up again. His legs carried him slowly down the street, past more stores, more faces that didn't notice him. Each step felt heavier, each breath harder. As the hours passed, the coins in his pocket jingled with every step, a constant reminder of how little he had. He thought about saving them for later, maybe for a hot coffee to warm his body when the sun went down. He thought about finding a quieter place where no one would laugh at him, no one would mock him, somewhere he could close his eyes and rest without fear. But the hunger kept pressing harder. His stomach cramped, his head felt light, and black spots began to blur his vision. He tried to steady himself by leaning against a lamppost, but his body was giving out. He had walked too long without food, too long without kindness. He looked around at the people passing by. None of them slowed down. None of them noticed the man swaying, fighting to stay on his feet. He wanted to call out, but his voice felt trapped in his throat. He took one last shaky step forward, and then everything went dark. His legs buckled, and he collapsed onto the cold pavement, his coins spilling from his pocket and rolling across the sidewalk. For a moment, the world moved on without him. Cars kept honking, people kept walking, and life in the city didn't pause. The man lay still, silent and unseen. The sound of laughter and clinking plates still echoed in his mind as he lay outside on the cold pavement. The diner door had shut behind him, but the sting of their words and mocking voices had not faded. He had wanted nothing more than a simple sandwich, just something to keep him on his feet for a little longer. Instead, he had been treated as though he were less than human, as though hunger was something to be laughed at. When he fell to the ground, his vision blurred, and for a while, he drifted between awareness and darkness. The world around him seemed distant. The hurried footsteps of strangers, the faint sound of a car horn, the chatter of people walking past. His body felt heavy, as if it no longer belonged to him. He wanted to move, to rise and keep going, but his strength was gone. Hunger and shame had drained him completely. For a few minutes, nobody noticed him. People stepped around him, some glancing down for a second and then quickly looking away. To them, he was just another homeless man on the street, one of many they saw every day. Some thought he might be drunk. Others assumed he was simply sleeping it off. No one stopped to check. It was easier to ignore him than to care. Inside the diner, life continued as if nothing had happened. The waitress carried plates of steaming food, and the customers went back to their conversations. Some of them had laughed at him only minutes earlier, but now they were too busy enjoying their meals to think about the man who had walked out hungry. Out on the street, the cold bit into his skin. His body trembled, though he was barely conscious enough to realize it. His lips were dry, his hands shaking as he tried to curl them close to his chest for warmth. He could hear distant voices but could not open his eyes fully. The coins he had carried slipped from his pocket and rolled across the sidewalk, but no one bothered to pick them up for him. Finally, a young man passing by slowed down, curious for a moment. He looked at the collapsed figure, frowned, then shook his head and kept walking. Probably drunk, he muttered under his breath. Others who noticed him thought the same. To them, it wasn't unusual to see someone lying on the street. It was part of the city, part of the background noise they had learned to ignore. But the man lying there wasn't just another stranger. He was someone who had once worn a uniform with pride, someone who had given his strength and youth to protect others. Yet now, his service meant nothing in the eyes of those who saw him. To them he was invisible, an inconvenience, a reminder of a life they didn't want to think about. Minutes felt like hours. His chest rose and fell slowly, and he struggled to stay awake. His thoughts wandered back to better times, marching with his fellow soldiers, laughing around a campfire, writing letters home. He remembered the feeling of belonging, of having a purpose. Now that sense of belonging was gone. The loneliness he felt on that sidewalk was deeper than any wound he had ever carried from war. Every attempt to open his eyes failed. His body begged for food, for warmth, for kindness, but none of those things came. People continued to walk past him, their footsteps echoing in his ears. The city was alive, but for him, it felt like the end. Suddenly, a loud voice from across the street broke through his fading thoughts. Someone shouted for a taxi, and the noise startled him enough to stir. He tried to lift his head, but the effort was too much. His body trembled, and he sank back to the pavement, his cheek pressing against the cold concrete. He felt the ground beneath him shaking slightly as footsteps approached, but he couldn't tell if they were coming toward him or simply passing by like the others. The humiliation of the diner still burned inside him. He had asked with respect, he had offered what little he had, and still they had laughed. What hurt most wasn't the hunger, It was being treated as though his life had no value, as if the years he had given, the sacrifices he had made were worth nothing at all. That wound was deeper than his empty stomach, and it was harder to heal. A small group of people exited the diner, chatting and laughing. One of them pointed in his direction, whispering something to the others. They looked, nodded, and then walked away, shaking their heads. No one came closer. No one asked if he was okay. The distance between him and the rest of the world grew larger with every passing second. He wanted to call out, to tell them he wasn't drunk, that he wasn't dangerous, that he was just hungry and tired. But his throat felt dry, his voice trapped inside him. All that escaped was a faint groan, too soft for anyone to hear. Time moved slowly. The sky above began to shift, clouds drifting across as the sun lowered a little more. Shadows stretched along the street, and the chill in the air deepened. His body curled in on itself, trying to keep whatever little warmth remained. His chest rose and fell unevenly, each breath a struggle. Somewhere deep inside he still carried hope. Hope that someone, anyone, would see him as more than just another man on the street. Hope that a small act of kindness would remind him that he was still human, that he still mattered. But as the minutes stretched on, that hope began to fade. The sounds of the city became distant, muffled. His mind drifted again, carrying him to places he had long left behind. He remembered his mother's kitchen, the smell of fresh bread when he was a boy. He remembered the first time he wore his uniform, standing tall, proud, ready to serve. He remembered friends he had lost, faces that would never grow old. These memories came like flashes of light in the darkness, comforting him even as his body weakened. On the pavement, he lay motionless. His hands were cold, his lips pale. People walked around him, and still no one stopped. To most, he was invisible, a shadow on the sidewalk. But inside his heart, a small spark remained. He didn't know it yet, but his story wasn't over. At that very moment, while the world turned its back, life was quietly preparing to place someone in his path. Someone who would see past the dirt on his clothes and the weariness in his face. Someone who would not laugh, not turn away, but reach out with compassion. His body was failing, his strength fading. But fate was about to send him a hand he never expected. And so, he lay there in silence, unaware that just around the corner, his life was about to change. The world around him was fading, but his heart kept fighting. His breathing was shallow, his body weak, and his mind drifted between memories of the past and the cold reality of the present. He lay there helpless on the hard sidewalk, the coins from his pocket still scattered a few feet away, glinting in the dull afternoon light. People continued walking by, busy with their own lives, not realizing that a man was slipping further into darkness right in front of them. Minutes stretched on, and his body grew heavier. The sound of voices blurred into a distant hum. He could no longer tell the difference between reality and the images flashing through his tired mind. For a moment he thought he could hear the voices of his fellow soldiers calling his name, the sound of marching boots on gravel, the whistle of the wind across an empty battlefield. His heart longed to be back with them, to feel that sense of brotherhood and belonging again. Just when he was about to let go completely, the sound of hurried footsteps broke through the haze. They were different from the rest. These footsteps slowed down when they reached him. A soft gasp followed, then a voice filled with concern. "Sir, are you okay?" He tried to open his eyes, but only a faint flicker showed. A figure knelt down beside him, blocking the harsh glare of the sky above. He could feel gentle hands on his shoulder, steadying him. The voice spoke again, softer this time. "Stay with me. You're going to be all right." The person was a young woman who had just finished her long shift at the hospital nearby. She carried a bag slung over her shoulder, her tired eyes scanning the man lying on the ground. Unlike the others who had walked past, she didn't see just another homeless figure. She saw a human being in desperate need of help. She crouched down, checking his pulse, then carefully tilted his head to make sure he was breathing properly. Her years of training as a nurse kicked in instantly. She recognized the signs: malnourishment, exhaustion, and dehydration. This wasn't someone drunk or careless. This was a man whose body was shutting down from neglect and hunger. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small water bottle. Opening the cap, she gently tried to give him a sip, tilting it carefully so he wouldn't choke. At first he coughed, but soon he managed to swallow a little. His cracked lips moved slightly, though no words came out. "Don't worry," she whispered reassuringly. You're safe now. I'm here." The man's vision cleared just enough for him to see her face. For a brief second he wondered if she was an angel, sent to lift him from his misery. His eyes watered, not from pain, but from the simple fact that someone had finally stopped to care. He wanted to speak, to thank her, but all he could manage was a weak nod. The woman looked around at the people passing by. Some glanced in curiosity, but none offered to help. Frustrated, she raised her voice. "Can someone call an ambulance, please? This man needs help." A few bystanders paused uneasy, but one finally pulled out a phone and dialed. She stayed kneeling beside him, holding his hand firmly, not letting him feel alone in those terrifying moments. She kept talking to him, encouraging him to keep breathing, to stay awake. "You've made it this far. Don't give up now," she said gently. As the minutes ticked by, the man slowly regained a little more awareness. He could hear her voice clearly now, a voice filled with warmth and compassion. He realized she wasn't treating him like a burden or a nuisance. She was treating him like a human being with dignity and care. It had been so long since anyone had looked at him that way. Soon the faint sound of sirens approached. Relief spread across the woman's face as she saw the ambulance turn the corner. She squeezed his hand gently. "Help is here," she assured him. The paramedics rushed out, quickly assessing the situation. They asked her what had happened, and she explained everything clearly. With practiced efficiency, they lifted the man onto a stretcher, covering him with a blanket to shield him from the cold. As they prepared to take him into the ambulance, he reached out weakly, his hand trembling. His fingers brushed against hers and his lips moved to form silent words. Though his voice was barely audible, she understood what he was trying to say. "Thank you." Her eyes softened. "You don't need to thank me," she replied quietly. "Just focus on getting better." The paramedics loaded him into the ambulance, but she didn't leave. Something inside her told her she couldn't just walk away. She quickly spoke to one of the paramedics and explained she was a nurse. They allowed her to ride along, knowing her presence might help keep the man calm. Inside the ambulance, she sat beside him, watching his chest rise and fall under the oxygen mask. He was still weak, but he was alive, and that was what mattered. She gently held his hand again, letting him know he wasn't alone. The ride to the hospital felt like a blur. Machines beeped softly, the paramedics worked quickly, and the man drifted in and out of consciousness. But every time he stirred, he saw her sitting there, steady and calm, and it gave him the strength to hold on. At the hospital, doctors rushed to examine him. They confirmed what the nurse had already suspected: severe malnourishment, dehydration, and extreme exhaustion. He needed rest, fluids, and proper nutrition. As they wheeled him into a room, the nurse followed, determined not to leave his side until she knew he was stable. Hours later, he finally woke up properly. The room was quiet except for the soft beeping of the machines. His body still felt weak, but his mind was clearer. Turning his head slightly, he saw her sitting in the chair beside his bed, her eyes heavy with fatigue but still filled with concern. She had stayed. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. Why did you help me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She leaned forward, offering him a gentle smile. "Because you needed someone, and nobody else stopped. That's all." His eyes filled with tears. "They laughed at me," he admitted quietly, his voice trembling. "I only wanted a sandwich." "And they laughed." Her heart ached at his words. She shook her head softly. "I'm sorry you went through that. You didn't deserve it. No one does." For the first time in years, he felt seen. Not as a burden, not as a problem, but as a person. Her kindness was like a light breaking through the heavy clouds that had followed him for so long. That night, as he drifted to sleep in the hospital bed, he carried with him the memory of her voice, the warmth of her hands, and the knowledge that someone had cared enough to stop. For a man who had almost given up hope, that small act of compassion was the beginning of something new. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew this: he was not invisible anymore. Someone had seen him, someone had helped him, and maybe, just maybe, his story wasn't finished yet. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft hum of machines. The man lay on the bed, his body still weak but his breathing steadier than before. The nurse who had helped him stayed by his side, coming back every chance she could between her duties. She didn't know much about him yet, but she knew he had been through more than most people could imagine. And for reasons she couldn't explain, she felt a deep sense of responsibility toward him. The man spent the first 2 days barely speaking. His body was so worn out that even forming words felt like a battle. The doctors gave him fluids, food in small portions, and medicine to help him recover. Every time he opened his eyes, he saw her sitting nearby, checking on him, asking softly if he needed anything. It felt strange for him. After so many years of being ignored on the streets, suddenly someone was treating him with care and respect. One morning, when he finally had enough strength, he tried to sit up. His hands trembled as he pushed himself against the pillow. The nurse quickly stepped forward to help. "Easy," she said gently. "You're still healing. Don't rush." He gave her a faint smile. I don't even know your name," he said, his voice hoarse. She told him softly, and then she added, "And what about you? What's your name?" There was a pause. For a moment it looked as if he was unsure whether to answer. He had grown used to being nameless in the eyes of strangers, used to being called "Hey you" or ignored completely. Finally, with a shaky breath, he said, "My name is Daniel." It was the first time in years that someone had asked him his name, and the first time he had spoken it out loud in what felt like forever. Hearing it again made him feel human, as if a piece of his identity had returned to him. Over the next few days, Daniel slowly began to share pieces of his story. He talked about his years in the military, how he had once marched proudly, carrying the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He spoke about the places he had seen, the battles he had survived, and the friends he had lost along the way. His voice grew heavy when he mentioned the memories that haunted him, the ones that never left even after the war ended. The nurse listened carefully, never interrupting, never judging. She didn't push him to say more than he wanted, but she made sure he knew she cared. For Daniel, that listening ear was a gift more valuable than food or shelter. It had been years since anyone had truly wanted to hear his story. As his strength returned, the hospital staff noticed a change in him. He wasn't just recovering physically. He was slowly regaining hope. The kindness he had been shown had lit a small spark inside him, one that had almost gone out completely. One afternoon, when he was strong enough to walk a few steps, the nurse brought him a tray of food. It was nothing fancy, just soup, bread, and some fruit. But to Daniel it felt like a feast. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, grateful for the simple act of being fed with dignity. After finishing, he looked up and said quietly, "You know, I didn't think I'd see another meal like this. That day at the diner, I thought it was the end for me." The nurse's eyes softened. "I'm glad it wasn't. Everyone deserves kindness, Daniel. What happened to you out there was wrong, but that doesn't define who you are." Her words stayed with him. For years he had been defined by the stares of strangers, the laughter of people who mocked him, and the silence of those who ignored him. But here, in this small hospital room, someone was reminding him that he was more than his struggles, more than his hunger. A few days later, the nurse returned with a visitor. She had reached out quietly to a local veteran support group, telling them about Daniel's condition. They came to the hospital with open hearts, ready to help. At first, Daniel was hesitant. He wasn't used to accepting help. But when one of the men from the group shook his hand firmly and said, "Brother, we've got your back now," something inside him broke. He felt tears well up, and for the first time in years, he didn't try to hide them. The veterans promised to help him find stable housing once he was released, along with counseling and resources to get back on his feet. Daniel listened carefully, still unsure if he deserved so much kindness, but the nurse encouraged him. "You've carried the weight of the world long enough," she told him. "It's okay to let others carry some of it now." Word about Daniel's story began to spread, though not because he wanted attention. A customer who had been at the diner that day had witnessed the cruel way he had been treated, and later, when they heard about what happened outside, they spoke up. Slowly, the story reached more people in the community. People were shocked and upset that a man who had once served his country could be treated with such disrespect. The diner where he had been humiliated faced heavy criticism. Customers stopped going, and the management quickly realized their mistake. But by then, the damage to their reputation had already been done. For Daniel, the focus wasn't on revenge or anger. He didn't want anyone punished. All he wanted was to be treated with dignity, something so simple yet so rare in his life. And now, thanks to the nurse and the support group, he was finally beginning to feel that dignity return. Every evening, as he sat in the hospital bed looking out the window, he thought about how close he had come to giving up. If she hadn't stopped that day, If she had walked past like everyone else, he might not have survived. That thought humbled him deeply. It reminded him how powerful one small act of compassion could be. As the weeks passed, Daniel grew stronger. He walked further each day, his body slowly regaining the strength it had once lost. He also began to smile more, even laugh occasionally, something the hospital staff noticed with joy. One evening, as the nurse checked on him before ending her shift, Daniel looked at her with gratitude in his eyes. "You saved my life," he said softly. She shook her head. "No, Daniel. You saved your own life. You held on long enough for someone to find you. All I did was remind you that you're not alone." Those words sank deep into his heart. For so long he had believed he was alone in the world, forgotten and invisible, but now he understood. Sometimes it only takes one person to remind you of your worth, and that reminder can change everything. Daniel still had a long road ahead, but the path no longer seemed impossible. He was no longer just a man lying on a cold sidewalk. He was a survivor, a fighter, and now, with people beside him, he had the chance to rebuild. The humiliation he had faced in that diner would always remain a painful memory, but it no longer defined him. What defined him now was the kindness that had reached him when he needed it most, and the courage to accept that kindness. For the first time in years, Daniel began to believe in tomorrow. The morning sun streamed through the hospital window, casting a soft glow on the floor. Daniel sat quietly in his chair, looking out at the world beyond the glass. His hands rested on his knees, steady now, no longer trembling from weakness. Weeks had passed since the day he collapsed outside the diner, and in that time everything had changed. His body had grown stronger, his spirit lighter, and for the first time in years he felt hope stirring inside him. The nurse walked in with her usual warm smile, carrying his breakfast tray. She placed it on the table and asked how he was feeling. Daniel smiled faintly, the lines on his face softening. "Better," he replied. "Much better than I ever thought I could feel again." As he ate, he thought about how different life looked now. Not long ago, his days were filled with wandering streets, searching for scraps and fighting against the loneliness that pressed down on him like a weight. Back then, every day felt the same, empty, hopeless, endless. But now there was a sense of direction. There were people around him who cared, who reminded him that his life still had meaning. When the Veterans Support Group visited again, they brought good news. They had arranged a small apartment for him through a housing program, a place where he could finally rest without worrying about the cold nights or the harsh stares of strangers. Daniel listened in silence at first, hardly able to believe what he was hearing. "An apartment?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "For me?" One of the men nodded firmly. "You've given so much already. It's time we make sure you're not left behind. You deserve this, brother." Tears welled in Daniel's eyes. For years he had been invisible. Now suddenly people were stepping forward, lifting him up when he no longer had the strength to stand on his own. He wiped his eyes quickly, embarrassed by the emotion, but no one in the room judged him. They understood. Moving into the apartment was a simple moment, but for Daniel it felt monumental. The walls were bare, the furniture minimal, yet it was more than he could have asked for. It was a place of safety, a place where he could close his eyes at night without fear. Standing in the doorway, he ran his hand along the wall, whispering to himself, "Home." The nurse stopped by on her day off to see how he was settling in. She brought along a small bag of groceries and a blanket. Daniel tried to protest, saying she had already done enough, but she simply smiled and placed the items on the counter. "You don't have to do this alone," she told him gently. Over the following weeks, Daniel began attending counseling sessions arranged by the support group. At first, he was hesitant to open up, afraid of digging through the heavy memories he had carried for so long. But with time, he found strength in speaking. He talked about the war, the friends he lost, the nightmares that followed him into every corner of his life. The counselors listened, offering guidance, but more importantly, they reminded him that healing was possible. The change in Daniel was slow but steady. Each day he walked a little taller. He began cooking small meals in his apartment, learning to take care of himself again. He started joining group meetings with other veterans, men and women who had walked similar paths, who understood the scars that couldn't be seen. In their company, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in years: belonging. The story of what had happened outside the diner continued to spread across the community. People who had once walked past him without a glance now recognized him on the street. Some stopped to shake his hand. Others apologized for not noticing his struggle sooner. Daniel never held bitterness toward them. Instead, he used those moments to remind them of something important. Kindness, he would say softly, doesn't cost much, but it can save someone's life. One afternoon, a local news station invited him to share his story. At first, Daniel hesitated. He didn't like the idea of being on television. He wasn't looking for fame or attention, but the nurse encouraged him. "Your story can change the way people see others like you," she explained. "It can open eyes, Daniel." And so, with a steady voice, he sat before the cameras and told his truth. He spoke about the humiliation he felt that day in the diner, about the collapse on the cold pavement, and about the simple act of compassion that saved him. He didn't name the people who mocked him. He didn't dwell on anger. Instead, he focused on the importance of seeing each person as human, no matter their situation. The interview touched many hearts. Messages poured in from people who said they would never again look at someone on the street the same way. Donations increased for shelters and veterans programs. And for Daniel, the knowledge that his pain had helped spark change gave him a new sense of purpose. Months passed, and Daniel continued to rebuild his life. He no longer spent his days wandering with an empty stomach and weary heart. Instead, he volunteered with the same group that had helped him, reaching out to other veterans living on the streets. He walked through parks, under bridges, into shelters, speaking to those who felt forgotten. "I've been where you are," he told them, "and I know it feels like nobody sees you. But you are not invisible. You matter." The men and women he spoke to listened differently because they knew he understood. His story was proof that even the darkest chapters could turn into new beginnings. One crisp autumn morning, Daniel stood in front of a small gathering organized by the support group. The nurse was there too, watching with quiet pride. He addressed the crowd, his voice steady and strong. "I once thought my life was over," he began. "I thought the world had turned its back on me. But one person's kindness reminded me that hope is never truly gone, and now it's my turn to pass that hope forward." The audience clapped warmly, but Daniel wasn't seeking applause. He was seeking connection. He wanted each person listening to understand that compassion had the power to heal wounds deeper than anyone could see. Later that evening, back in his apartment, Daniel sat quietly with a cup of tea. He thought about the long road he had traveled, the uniform he once wore with pride, the battlefields that haunted his dreams, the years of wandering streets hungry and alone. And he thought about the moment he collapsed outside the diner, when life seemed to have reached its end. That moment, which could have been his last, had instead become the turning point. Because someone had chosen to care, his story had not ended on that sidewalk. It had continued, grown, and transformed into something he never expected. Daniel leaned back, closing his eyes. The pain of the past was still there, but it no longer ruled him. In its place was a sense of peace, a quiet strength, and a promise to himself, to never let others feel as invisible as he once did. His life had been restored, not by grand gestures or miracles, but by simple acts of humanity. A sip of water, a helping hand, a kind word. These small things had built a bridge from despair to hope. And now, Daniel walked that bridge every day, offering others a way across. In the end, his story was not one of humiliation, but of redemption. It was not about the cruelty he faced, but about the kindness that saved him. And as he looked toward the future, he knew that his journey was not just his own. It was a reminder to the world that every person, no matter how broken or forgotten, carries a story worth saving.